So technically, it is that time of the year where I should be at university. I think my lectures actually started last week. However, I'm actually doing a work placement here in the UK, which is part of my master's, and therefore I'm going to be based here for the next few months still. And yes, it's an exciting work placement. However, since it is September, and I know that lots of people are going back to school or back to uni or back to studies, even back to work if they've had a summer holiday at least, I thought, why don't I do some back to school books? Now, these sort of books are actually inspired by that kind of meme that was going around on Twitter the other week where people were saying, write 5 TV shows or 5 movies or 5 books that you would give to somebody to best represent you. And so I thought that what I could do is I could actually do that, but choose 5 books that best represent my degree. So I got Miriam involved because I know Miriam's starting her new major and minor this year, and she's very excited for it. And yeah, I just thought it'd be nice to kind of go through 5 books that aren't exactly relevant to my degree, but yet kind of represent my degree the best to somebody who might not know about it otherwise. So the first book I got is Lotus Quest. Now, I've talked about Lotus Quest before on my channel, I think. This is a travel writing book written by Griffiths. Now, this book was a really enjoyable travel writing book because it explored Japan and it explored this man's travels through Japan, but it was kind of like based around looking at the history and the way that the lotus plays a part in Japanese culture and how different areas of Japan kind of have different ways of treating the lotus flower, different ways of meaning for the lotus flower, representing in their everyday lives, etc, etc. So I chose this one because my master's is applied cultural analysis. Now, part of that actually involves sort of analysing a cultural phenomenon. So, for example, just like this book kind of focuses on the lotus flower, I would focus on just one cultural phenomenon and then understand how different people kind of treat that cultural phenomenon and how it changes and alters dependent on other people's cultures from other perspectives. You know, like, for example, people who are living in an area in Sweden might not all be Swedish, so when they partake in a particular cultural phenomenon, they won't partake in it the same way. And I thought that was kind of very interesting about this book in that it just focuses on the lotus flower, but by looking at history and it in different cultural contexts across Japan, it explores the same thing but in different ways and kind of allows space to understand the way that culture alters dependent on the person who's practicing it. So then I chose a second book. My second book is quite a funny one, actually. It is The Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. Now, I chose this book because, whilst I'm pretty sure most of you have probably heard of this book at least, if you haven't read it, I chose this one because on my course we study a lot of sort of social philosophers, and there's a lot of thinkers who create ideas about how to analyse social and cultural contexts, I guess. And a lot of them are actually Marxists. Now, I was actually set this book to read on my undergraduate when I was doing writing, directing and performance at York. It was part of a political theatre module, so we were looking at sort of Boal and Brecht and other contemporaries who were doing political things in the theatre and how some of them were influenced by the Communist Manifesto. So I chose this one because whilst a lot of the philosophers on my course don't actually ever really reference the Communist Manifesto or Marxism itself, to be able to contextualise what they're saying, what they're meaning, and why they've developed their thoughts in a sort of specific way requires you to at least have some basic knowledge in kind of Marxist thought. And I thought the Communist Manifesto is actually probably a pretty good way to start and to get just that little bit of context behind the people that you're studying. It particularly helped knowing this kind of in reference to Henri Lefebvre, who is it was difficult trying to understand his text and his text in regards to space, but contextualizing it with his Marxist ideas does actually help. Then I chose The People in the Trees by Hanya Yanagihara. Now I chose this book in particular because this one's a little bit more specifically directed and linked with my course of study. Now this book kind of deals with a few things, and I think there are some similarities between this one and A Little Life. However, what I'm going to focus on is the role that science and anthropology plays in this book. So since I'm studying applied cultural analysis, a lot of it is actually anthropological and relates very much to anthropology. And one of the characters in this book is an anthropologist. Now he is joined by a scientist as they go to kind of do research on a new community on an island that has been otherwise unaffected by Western culture. So there's really interesting discussions here about the kind of links and the differences between the hard sciences and the social sciences, and there's some really interesting thoughts about the role that these different sciences play in kind of the academic world and their importance for people who study them. It also kind of deals with a lot of moral and ethical implications that come with studying otherwise like sort of non-Western marginalized peoples, and the impact that you as an anthropologist can have on a community who are otherwise thriving without any westernization, which kind of poses some really interesting questions and really like made me think about kind of what implications could my work in the future have, and I don't know, the topics that it dealt with were really thought-provoking and very powerful, and also a little bit empowering, but there is like a dark twist to it also, which makes the story itself quite exciting and quite intriguing and keeps you pushing on. Now, when I am studying, I am studying in Lund in Sweden, but however, in my first year specifically, I was also kind of sharing classes with Copenhagen University, so I chose Often I'm Happy by Jens Christian Grøndahl, because whilst I don't have any Swedish authors, this author, he lives in Copenhagen and he writes in Danish, and he also translates himself, which is really interesting and really great. I haven't actually read this book yet, but I did choose it to represent my degree just because of that link with Copenhagen. And actually my first year I did spend a lot of time in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen just has a completely different feel to perhaps Lund or Malmö, where I also spent a lot of time. And I think, that sort of link to Copenhagen was very important to my studies, and it was very important to my degree, because we also had lecturers from the University of Copenhagen who are, one of them in particular, had some very interesting things to share and some great knowledge that he wanted to impart to us, and I found his lectures really fascinating. So yeah, I chose this book because it does have that link with Copenhagen, and I don't know, a little bit of my heart would always be in Copenhagen, especially like sort of the afternoons that we would spend there, or even like the evenings that we would spend there, and our dinners at the food market on Paper Island, which doesn't exist anymore, which is very sad. So finally, the next book that I chose is going to be The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Now this book in particular, again, isn't exactly relevant to my degree, but there are themes within it which I think can help to represent a lot of things that go on my degree. So it's one of the classics, but The Picture of Dorian Gray, if you don't know, is basically about a young man who almost perpetually stays young. He lives a very hedonistic lifestyle, and that impacts the friends that he first makes. As his lifestyle sort of develops and his friends kind of grow a bit more distant with him, kind of it gets darker and twistier, and sort of we understand the role that sin and immorality play in this book, and kind of the impacts that it has on different characters and the way that they live their lives, and the implications of the actions that they do. So I chose this one just because being a cultural analyst has a sort of form of duality to it, particularly when you are collecting your data. So you oftentimes will go to a place or a community and you're researching them. So you have a sort of guard up in which you are a researcher. You have ethical practices that you have to retain, and you are kind of talking to people in the hopes to get information from them to expand knowledge about how different people do things, why people do things, and then kind of because of that, it can get sort of there are some ethical greyness. There are boundaries which shouldn't be crossed. There are some boundaries which you're going to have to make up yourself because there aren't any sort of rules for them yet. And sometimes when you are doing your research, because you're spending so much time with a group of people, you oftentimes become friends with them, and when you do become friends with them, you're then faced with a further sort of moral conundrum in which you are later going to write a research paper or an academic paper about them, and there is the potential that they'll be very offended and upset by what you write because it's not how they interpret it, but that's how you interpreted their actions almost. So there's like this sort of really grey area, and that kind of theme of this grey area and how your actions have further impacts in a way that you might not think, particularly when it comes to morals and ethics when working and dealing and treating with other people. That kind of element of this book I feel best represents a massive theme of my degree, in which we are constantly in this flux of debating, what is ethical practice, what can we do to ensure we're constantly working ethically, and how do we sort of move around this grey area when it does become a little bit more tricky to be wholly moralistic if you're dealing with friends or people you love, etc., etc. So it does really make you think critically a lot more about what you are doing. So those are my 5 books, and I think, that should give you quite a good idea of what I do on my degree. You can check Miriam's video out down in the link below, and if you are going back to university, or you are going back to school, or even if you have finished university but you still want to make a video like this where you use 5 books to represent your studies, or even 5 books to represent your work, I'd love to see you. So if you do a video like this kind, let me know down in the comments below. So yes, that's basically my degree represented in 5 books. I hope you liked it. Bye bye.